Welcome everyone to this online launch event of the NORRAG Special Issue number 6, States of Emergency Education in the Time of COVID-19. NORRAG is a network dedicated to working on international education and training, cooperation and policy. And as you can see, this is the 6th in our series of NORRAG Special Issues. And we are very proud that at the quality and the speed at which this was turned around, because this really is the issue of this year, the issue of our time, and also carries other learnings for us going forward and reaching into the past and also reaching into the future. We will be putting the link for this publication into the chat at the end of the event. So do stay around for that when we will actually have the official launch of the publication. First of all, welcoming everyone to this event and to this very important and timely publication. We have been absolutely thrilled to work with the UCL Institute of Education, with Will Brem, Moses Okech, and Elaine Unterhalter as guest editors to this special issue, and also the 6 authors of the key pieces of each of the 6 sections of NSI 6 who are speaking here today. And these are the subtitles of the 6 sections, and you can see how they all are relevant now and have been relevant in the past and will continue to be relevant. Inequalities, technology, states, progress, affect, and nature. After an introduction by our guest editors, the author of each of the key pieces in these 6 areas will then take the floor, and then we will move on to the Q&A. So, first of all, very happy to introduce you to Moses Okech, Will Brem, and Elaine Unterhalter from UCL Institute of Education in the UK, who were our fantastic guest editors for this special issue. Moses.
Thank you, Moira, and I'm Moses, for those who want to put a face to the name. And I'm one of the co-editors for the special issue, and I co-direct the Center for Education and International Development here at UCL Institute of Education with my colleague, Professor Elaine Unterhalter, whom you'll hear from shortly. Just to say that if you want to know a little bit more about the center, we call it CEID in short, CEID. Please just type CEID and UCL into any of the search engines, e.g. Google, and that will take you to our website and you'll learn a lot more about the center and what we do. As co-editors, it has been a privilege to develop this special issue over the past year during this period of the pandemic. The initial idea grew out of the Center for Education and International Development blog series, which was entitled Education in the Time of COVID-19. And this started around April 2020 when we started this blog series. And this was further developed through a webinar by the same name, which was held in September 2020. And also later on, a NORRAG KIX EAP Webinar, which was held in April 2021, entitled What Has COVID Done to Education and Research? And this featured some of the authors who have contributed to this NORRAG special issue. Our thanks to the many CEID colleagues who made the blog series possible over the period of about 20 months, as well as the 63 authors in this special issue, who graciously responded to a range of comments and feedback, preparing articles for the publication. Personally, it's been quite fulfilling to work with my colleagues, Will Brem and Elaine Unterhalter, but also with the support of Moira from NORRAG. It's been a great journey, learning a lot from different contexts about the impact of COVID on education. Without saying much, I think I'm not the key star today. The authors are, and the key leaders of the sections. I would therefore like to invite my colleague, Will Brem, to say more about the work. Will, please.
Thank you, Moses, and thank you, NORRAG, for inviting us to co-edit this special issue, and to all the authors who are here today and who are in the special issue for all the hard work you've done over the last few months. It's been a real pleasure putting this together. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the actual special issue, what's in it, and give you a flavor. But I actually want to start with a quote that I've been thinking a lot about over the past 18 months, and it's by Blaise Pascal. And he's a 17th century French mathematician and physicist and philosopher. And he said, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. When COVID-19 locked down London, which is where I live, in March of 2020, I was confronted with a real paradox. On the one hand, I saw a renewed sense of, for lack of a better word, socialism, a respect of others by staying inside, of social distancing, of wearing masks. And even this emergence of something called mutual aid societies. I saw flyers all over the streets. And it was really quite a powerful moment to bear witness and also participate in. But on the other hand, I felt so incredibly isolated and individual. I was literally sitting in a room alone. And of course, that is perhaps the best way to stop this virus from spreading. But of course, not everyone has the privilege to be alone, to sit alone in a room. I live in a pretty economically diverse community in London. And it quickly became apparent that many people, most of whom were people of color, were experiencing a very different lockdown where they couldn't afford to stay safe by staying inside or alone. And this paradox really stuck with me over the past 18 months, and in a sense became the prism through which I started to understand the pandemic. There were just simply no clear answers coming out of the pandemic. I don't know how other people feel, but that's how I felt at a loss in many ways. And so over these, over the early months of 2020, Elaine, Moses, and I began a conversation that would eventually turn into this special issue. We struggled with how we should even begin to understand the moment while it was still unfolding all around us. How can we begin to conceptualize and theorize COVID-19 in education without the virtue of hindsight? The CEID blog and the webinars that Moses mentioned, they sort of helped us begin to conceptualize our thinking, to sort of systematize what we were beginning to see, to help make sense of the world around us. So what was it that we began to see? Well, first off, we saw that COVID-19 was an emergency. It was a moment of conflict the world over needed to confront. But what was that emergency in particular? We realized that there were many states of emergency, not simply one. It was certainly a health and biological emergency, but it was also a political emergency, an economic emergency, a social emergency, and probably an environmental emergency. From there, we tried to unpack the different sites where these emergencies exist. And this is how we arrived at these 6 themes: inequalities, technology, states, progress, affect, and nature. And so the special issue, as Moira mentioned, is organized around these themes. But since COVID-19 was still unfolding, we wanted to make sure that these themes were seen as a dialectic, a conversation of possibility, rather than a definitive statement of closure. So as such, this is why we created these key pieces, and we asked certain authors to write a key piece that would start each thematic part of the special issue. The other contributions within that part would then refer to and engage with the arguments presented in the key piece. And each would start from its own particular viewpoint or experience or problem. And this dialogue across pieces was intended and actually does open up spaces of thought and practice, which is exactly what we realized we needed while still living through this emergency. I won't say much about the key pieces since the authors will actually present shortly. For now, I'd like to just make a few comments sort of reading across the special issue. So overall, the special issue contains 29 chapters, and these chapters are authored by 66 people who are affiliated with various institutions from across the world, including universities, schools, community organizations, civil society, and the private sector. The chapters basically deal with every phase of education, from early childhood to postgraduate study. They focus on a wide range of actors, including children and parents and teachers and administrators and creative industry workers and institutional leaders and even commentators. And in a sense, COVID-19 has impacted everyone, and this special issue really begins to start showing that. Authors utilize a diversity of methodologies, some collecting data using quite innovative ways given the travel restrictions and social distancing in some jurisdictions. Some deploy familiar conceptual frameworks, while others consider the need for new forms of theory. The work as a whole illuminates how profound the changes in education have been, some of the harshness of the effects on everyday educational life, and some of the forms reflection takes regarding what might be possible in thinking about different kinds of futures. The states of emergency in education and international development brought on by COVID-19 are varied and complex across countries and different social groups. Although it is too early to tell if people and institutions will find a way through the political, the economic, and the social challenges wrought by the pandemic, the chapters in this volume offer formative reflections that suggest key discursive material changes are actually being put into place. So state intervention is now being discussed openly as needed to create public value, not correct market failures. This is a major shift from neoclassical economic orthodoxies that have reigned supreme in public policy for over 40 years. Now, of course, it's discursive. We'll have to see if this actually leads to any material changes going forward. Teachers are now seen as care workers, essential for communities and society. The difference with previous descriptions of deficit is marked. Widespread vulnerabilities such as mental health and poverty are openly being discussed in education, with demands for collective action and care rather than individual blame. So in putting these pieces together in this special issue, we hope they will inspire people to turn these emerging ideas into good theory for practice, new lived experiences, and fair institutions. And I personally hope here everyone will be able to sit quietly in a room alone while reading this special issue cover to cover. So thank you again for all of the authors' contributions to this special issue. I now want to turn it over to Elaine, who will try and contextualize this special issue within the larger literature on COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Moses. Thanks, Moira, and a big thank you to all the authors whose work we're launching today. I must say that my taste for sitting quietly in a room is not very well formed, as I'm talking from a quarantine hotel. So there's a kind of bitter tang to sitting quietly in a room. But what I wanted to bring out is, I think what that kind of contrast between me and Will at this moment shows out how complex and different the experience of the pandemic has been. And in just wrapping up these comments from us as three editors, I wanted to highlight three areas that I think are distinctive about this special issue, because it's one of 4 projects I've done this year on the effects of COVID on education. And I feel I have read hundreds of articles on this topic. And so this is what I think is special about this special issue. I think the first thing that's special about it is the regional breadth and the analytic depth. I think one of the features that came out of COVID, as well as a kind of incredible localism, we were all for different periods, but confined to small spaces, was that there was a methodological localism. And the method par excellence, I think, has been the surveys and the telephone surveys or online surveys. That was the way in which we came to know what was going on. And surveys are very good for snapshots and very bad for understanding, or they have limited use in understanding the why, the how, and some of the complexity. And so that's what I think this special issue, because of its range of methods and range of voices and range of regions, adds, it contributes a range of perspectives and kind of unpicks some of that methodological localism. I think another thing that the special issue does, in contrast to some of the many, many publications that are coming out, is that it goes below the headline issue of markers of inequality. People reached, I think, too quickly for headline markers, gender or socioeconomic status, because the complexity of the ways in which these relationships were being reformulated was not available to us. That's part of the newness of the state of emergency. Our vocabularies are not equipped. And I think that's another thing this special issue does in developing kinds of critiques of intergenerational inequality, or solutions that are there in plain sight that we haven't used because we've done too much saying and not enough doing. Those sorts of issues, I think the special issue illuminates in a really deep way. And the third thing it does is it engages in dialogue. I think this is, Moira's spoken about it, Will's spoken about it, Moses has spoken about it, and I think you'll hear that a lot. It opens the space of saying, the only way we can make sense of this is actually by talking to each other, listening respectfully, and trying to acknowledge the complexity and our vulnerabilities. They're shared vulnerabilities, but they're experienced differently. And so because it has all this texture, and the texture comes from the dialogue, I think it's a wonderful piece of work, and adding my thanks, celebrating its launch, and looking forward to lots more growth of insight around these issues. So passing back to you, Moira.
Thank you so much for that, Elaine. And I have to say, you have all been very generous in naming me. I am part of a much bigger team, and this would not have happened if it hadn't been for Anouk Pasquier, if it hadn't been for Paul Gerhardt, for Daniela Andanova, for Rebecca Shepherd, and also Georgia Thorne. So thank you to all of them in that team who worked on this and making this the success that it is. Right, and now we will pass over to Frances Stewart, who's Professor Emeritus at the University of Oxford, who will talk us through the theme of inequalities. Frances, over to you. You can start sharing now. Are you still on mute, Frances?
Okay, sorry. First of all, thank you. I've enjoyed being part of this community, which I'm not normally part of. So it's really interesting to dip my toes into it. I did a survey on the basis of masses of other surveys of what had been happening to education and inequality in the world. And I have to say that it's a very unnuanced conclusion I come to. It is a headline conclusion, and even the individual pieces, they don't dialogue, they don't disagree. We all come to the same view. You can see on the screen all the other people who contributed very valuable pieces on this. And basically the conclusion is there that it made inequalities worse, educational inequalities between individuals and between groups, in rich and poor countries and between countries. And now I'll give you a little bit of evidence which is in the paper to support that, but it really is a very unnuanced headline conclusion. Now I have a problem with trying to. So first inequalities, no, sorry. First, what happened? There was massive reduction, a closure of schools. 80% of the children in the world were shut out of school. And this was very unequalizing because there was inequalities in the provision of substitute teaching, inequalities in the facilities for accessing the substitute teaching, in Wi-Fi, in TVs, in radios, inequalities in parents' ability to support home education and in space to study and light to study with. There was a negative and unequal impact on employment and incomes, and rising poverty meant that more and more children had to work. But there was one non-unequalizing effect, which is that the very poorest children in the world were not in school at all, and so they were not affected. 9% of the world's children were not in primary school, 18% were not of that age, were not in secondary school. So we have to qualify the conclusion from that point of view. First, what about between countries? In poor sub-Saharan African countries, less than half of the children had access to radio or TV, and less than 20% had internet access, whilst in Europe and North America, as we know, nearly everybody has internet access. Upper and middle income countries were able to provide support for access to distance learning, support for children who didn't have computers and so on, whereas very few children in poor countries got that. Most of the teachers in high-income countries continued to work. That was not true in low-income countries. In fact, in Asia and Africa, 80% of the children had no contact with teachers, which contrasts with 20% in North America. And then, as we know, parental education is very low in many low-income countries. In some African countries, less than half adult females had completed even primary education. And over 40% of the children in Africa had no one to help them at home, which of course contrasts with Europe or America. And then we find that within country inequalities increase for very much the same sort of reason. One of the papers shows that in Peru, rural communities lacked access to the internet, parents lacked education, and children had to work on the farm. So obviously they didn't get much education. In Ethiopia, the disadvantaged got the least support from the government, and again, the rural areas were particularly in trouble, and the rural teachers were least likely to help. In Ecuador, children at the top quartile had twice as much internet access as the bottom quartile. And it's interesting that wherever you look in the world, the same story comes out, this unequalizing effect. I didn't find any study which didn't find that. Same was true in rich countries. In the Netherlands, the fall in test scores was much higher in children from less educated homes. In America, the US, the fall in math scores was over 70% for pupils in the bottom quartile, but only 30% in the top. And in Britain, 2/3 of the children from the richest quintile were offered active help, but less than half in the bottom quintile. And the private schools, of course, did get particularly good help. Now, putting all this together, the worsening inequalities are likely to have a very serious long-run adverse impact. And I think that's the thing we need to now focus on. Poorer countries and poorer and remote schools are likely to take longer to recover. I think the recovery rates are going to be very different in poor countries and rich countries. Some children may not return to school at all. And these effects are going to have long-run impact on the earnings and health of poor children in both rich and poor countries, but especially in poor countries. So all in all, it's a very dismal story of enhancing what were already quite major inequalities in education have become much worse as a result of COVID. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frances, for that very important look at the unequalizing effects of COVID, and that very important reminder that those that weren't in school in the first place continued to be out of school, and we shouldn't overlook that fact. So in part 2, we turn to Ulrike Rivett, who's a professor in the Department of Information Systems at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, to talk to us about technology. Ulrike.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you for inviting me to this event, and it was a very exciting publication, fantastic to work with you all. I'm really honored to be part of it. So if you reflect on the last 18 months, there are a couple of things that will forever remain in our minds. And one of them is certainly going to be how technology became more than ever part of our lives. Work, school, shopping, computers, laptops, mobile phones. The list of engagements with technology is literally endless when we reflect on the last 18 months. So part 2 of the publication reflects on how technology, digital innovation, and reliance on technology have impacted us in the educational sector. So what does it mean to be connected? How can we rethink our physical and digital teaching spaces? And how can we not only fulfill, but thrive in a changed and changing environment? And also, what have we lost on the journey of moving into the digital space? I thought it would be really useful to reflect on the papers that my co-authors have written in this section. So Alessia Mikko-Moldovan highlights for us how the transition to remote learning impacted the experience of educators and students. Digital inequalities resulted in an increased vulnerability of already disadvantaged communities. But there's also hope and suggestions for building equity into the digital teaching space. Aspects such as user access and training, management of expectation, and the support for social emotional needs were highlighted as some of the recommendations for reducing inequalities and supporting vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. In the paper, Making Visible Inequality, Remote Learning with Technology During COVID-19, the authors Crompton, Jordan, Wilson, and Nicolai use a systematic review to identify mitigation strategies and gaps in our understanding of digital inequities. The reality of being unconnected in a highly connected world impacts us all differently. Access to technology, internet infrastructure, our digital literacy, our freedom, our gender, and the technical support we have access to impact equity and separate the world again into the have and have-nots. In the paper, the development of meaningful partnerships we identify as a key mitigation strategy to counteract the digital inequities we see emerging. The notion of digital agency and pedagogic approaches of 110 teachers in Delhi is insightfully described by Kusha Anand and Marie Lau. By reflecting on the notion of agency in a digital space, the connection between digital competence, confidence, accountability, and ability are highlighted as the fundamental building blocks in the digital education world. Spatial concepts of studying from home and how that impacts a teacher-learner relationship are reflected upon. The findings highlight how digital confidence impacts teaching experience and how we need to consider this in order to move the educational sector carefully into the future. Javier Naftali Kamara concludes part 2 by reflecting in a deep and meaningful way on the marginalization of asylum seekers and refugees during the lockdown in England. From the profound impact of not being able to access food, access to technology and the challenge of digital literacy are highlighted as 2 aspects that we need to reflect on when seeing technology as an enabler. We know that technology can enable, and we also know that technology can amplify. But we need to recognize that technology amplifies the good, the bad, and also the mediocre. And it can never amplify what doesn't exist in the first place. Equality and social justice are not created through technology. Technology will show us even clearer where our shortcomings lie. However, if we can recognize what is and isn't possible through technology and reflect on that with all the seriousness and urgency we ought to show in our education sector, I believe it will assist us in moving into a better digital future. And I really believe this chapter will add to that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrike, and particularly for that observation that technology amplifies what is there. If what you have is inequality, that will be amplified, and therefore allows us to see more critically what it is that's there and what it is that we want to be there, and how those two things may not be in quite alignment. In part 3, Adam Habib, who's Professor and Director of the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, took on the topic of states. Adam.
Thank you very much, colleagues. And I must say, it's been a real pleasure to be part of the team, and thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts. I think what I have to say flows neatly from the first two engagements. And perhaps I should start by making the very simple assumption that what COVID has powerfully shown us is that all of our challenges are global in character. Whether we're talking about this public pandemic, or whether we're talking about what Francis touched on, which was inequality, or many of the other challenges around social and political polarization, climate change, etc. All of these challenges are effectively global in character. And if they are global in character, we need global solutions to these global challenges. And that suggests to me that we require two fundamental elements. We need good science and good technology, but we need good science and good technology being thought through in relation to context itself. If you think of technology independent of context, then it doesn't have the effect that it's meant to. And so technology, if you like, science and context come together in a powerful way. And it seems to me that that's the first big element we need to understand. The second is we need institutional capacity and human capabilities around the world, because you can't deal with the local manifestations of global challenges if you do not have the institutional capacity or the human capabilities. In this pandemic, you needed hospitals, you needed clinics, you needed institutional capacity, but you needed doctors, you needed nurses, you needed all kinds of professional capacities to come to bear on addressing the challenge that existed. And the big question that we have to ask ourselves in this moment is, how have we responded to that? Now, everybody I speak to, it seems to me, speaks about the importance of digital technologies, and my colleagues as fellow vice chancellors and directors speak to that. But actually what this poses in a powerful way is a reimagination of higher education. Because actually higher education, and particularly the partnerships we claim in the name of solidarity in higher education, have actually undermined institutional capacity and human capabilities around the world. If you look at statistical data around the brain drain or on global scholarships, you will find that actually our ability of global partnerships, this model where we find talented people in the developing world and bring them to London and New York and Berlin to train, actually weakens institutional capacities there. It weakens human capabilities. And so the big question that we should be asking post-COVID is, what are we going to do to reimagine higher education and reimagine its partnerships to enable that to happen? And if we're going to reimagine higher education, it seems to me the digitized technologies that Ulrike spoke about could be an enabler. But it's only an enabler if we have the political will. It's only an enabler if we are prepared to co-curriculate, if we prepare to co-teach, if we prepare to co-credential, if we prepare to really partner in equitable partnerships in higher education and not simply use that as a rhetorical instrument. And so it seems to me that's the big issue. Now, states, given the current notion of statecraft, I actually work against that. There isn't the political will, because their ambit, their horizon is national, not global. It's not transnational. And frankly, the business model of higher education, particularly in large parts of the Western world, North America, the UK, actually undermines that potential possibility of transnational conversation. And so in a sense, it seems to me, we've got a huge problem because states and the business model of higher education in many parts of the Western world undermine the very possibility of reimagining higher education so that we can create the institutional capacities and human capabilities there. And people like myself, the people at the helm of these institutions, duck that fundamental question. 2 weeks ago, I sat in Newcastle with my fellow vice chancellors, and we all celebrated this new notion of higher education and the fact that 400,000 students in the UK made the UK 28 billion pounds. And we're going to increase that to 600,000. Not one of us was prepared to raise that fundamental question about what does it do for institutions in the developing world? What does it do for human capabilities in the developing world? And is that not going to raise what Francis started off with, that in this post-COVID world, we're going to accelerate the inequalities rather than beginning to address them? That's the historical challenge, it seems to me, that we confronted with. That's the question that we all need to collectively answer, including myself and the colleagues at the helm of higher education institutions in the Western world. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that passionate speech, Adam, and soul searching, and the important issue that you raise in terms of that actually brings exactly what Will was speaking about, these different parts into conversation with each other, the states with the inequalities and also the technology. Thank you so much for that. And now we will move on to progress with Keita Takayama, who is the professor, the Graduate School of Education in Kyoto University, Japan. Keita, over to you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, fine.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So what I'm gonna do today is just to talk about the paper that I contributed to the special project, but also try to put my piece in dialogue with the two other pieces that are also included under progress, and then share some of my reflections on the differences between my piece and the two other pieces that are responding to my piece. So my contribution to this project is titled Rethinking Progress and Time and Japanese Nightingales and COVID-19 in Kyoto. It is a personal and reflective piece situated in a very local context where I live and work. And instead of studying how COVID disrupted the day-to-day operation of schools and universities and how the disruption impacted teachers and students, my piece simply talked about how it disrupted my work at the university and my life as a whole. But more importantly, the piece focuses on the kind of reflection caused by the disruption. The reflection triggered by COVID was about the notion of time. When all the items on my calendar, including meetings, classes, international domestic trips, and deadlines for writings were either wiped out of my calendar or rendered inconsequential, I felt absolutely lost. And now that all the near future goals were gone, I did not know how to plan and organize my day. And that was when I realized the extent to which every minute of my professional life was guided by the notion of futurity, or the linear progressive notion of time, wherein the immediacy of the present is always subordinated to the future, wherein every second of life, every second of my life is coordinated towards future certainties. So just when I was spending aimless days at home, I was partly self-isolating because I was a bit sick. I noticed a beautiful singing of Japanese nightingales in my neighborhood in the northern part of Kyoto where I live. At first, I was surprised that the birds are here in my neighborhood. Then I started wondering how come I had not noticed their mesmerizing singing till that moment, which was 6 months after moving into this neighborhood. Was I able to finally hear it because COVID slowed down my life, so I could afford to pay attention to what was happening in my surroundings? Or did it have anything to do with the fact that all the future goals in my calendar had been wiped out by then, so that I was more prepared to appreciate the immediacy of the moment? Then I tried to carry this reflection on time into my own online teaching. And I discussed how I attempted to disrupt the sense of linearity in the structure of the course, and how I managed to leave clock and calendar out of my teaching space to allow for meaningful learning experience for myself and for my students. There is perhaps one notable difference between my contribution and the other two pieces that are included under the category of progress. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the authors for trying to engage with my nonsensical work. Balakrishnan and Johar's piece, these are two public school teachers in Malaysia. They wrote this piece called The Pandemic Shock on an Education System, an Actor Network Theory Perspective. And the other piece included was Durrani et al.'s piece titled Education, the Status of Pupil Learning and Well-Being in Secondary Schools of Sierra Leone during COVID-19 school closure. So those two pieces were responding to my piece. So the first piece from Malaysia reports on how global education tech company, global edtech companies capitalize upon the learning loss, so-called the learning loss created by the pandemic in Malaysia. The authors are concerned that the pandemic opened the market for global edtech companies, including Google, and this could radically change the nature of teachers' work and public education in Malaysia. But there seems to be less concerned, in my view at least, about the sense of futurity or linearity that was supposed to be restored by active participation of for-profit companies. It felt as if the futurity and linearity are good things. They are necessary to arrest the learning loss. What is bad in their view is how they are restored and who is doing the restoration. The second piece from Sierra Leone reports on the challenges faced by students during the COVID-induced school closure in Sierra Leone. The study shows that many children's learning was severely affected by the school closure, especially those who were economically struggling, were the hardest hit. Furthermore, it also reports on all sorts of abuses experienced by children, both at home and in their communities. To such children, school is one of the few places where their physical, emotional well-beings are looked after. Hence, once again, the authors of this piece, the task is to bring back the normality of linearity or clock and calendars back into children's lives. So by now, the gap has become very pronounced between my piece and the other two pieces that are responding to mine. On the one hand, my piece considers COVID as a fruitful pedagogic moment. I see disruption as a powerful source of reflection and new learning. On the other hand, those who responded looked at COVID as causing learning loss, which must be arrested as quickly as possible. Here, disruption is a problem to be rectified. They are keen to restore the stability premised upon the progressive and linear notion of time. Because of this difference, I'm afraid that the authors of the other pieces struggle to make any meaningful reference to my piece. They both refer to my work, and yet in a way that does not accept the whole premise of the discussion, that is to question the modern narrative of progress and the underpinning notion of time, futurity, and clock on time clock time and a modern teleology. I want to be clear here. This is not at all a criticism of the other authors who kindly responded to my piece, by the way. Rather, it is an attempt to foreground the gap so that we can reflect on why it actually exists in the first place. Regardless of how we see the modern progressive notion of time in education, one thing is clear to me. That is, the introduction of clock and calendar is not culturally neutral. It is a product of Western modernity. And one can safely argue that it is fundamental to the formation of a particular kind of society. But what is often forgotten here is that it renders other kind of society difficult to realize, if not impossible. This selectivity inherent in the simple act of introducing clock and calendar ought to be acknowledged by anyone who pursue and develop it. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Keita, and bringing those reflections on the different ways in which time can be experienced and also the different potential solutions or productive reasons why we could welcome that disruption rather than looking to close it completely. Thank you. Now we are going to move on to part 5, Affect, with Irving Epstein, who is the Professor of Peace and Justice Emeritus at Illinois Wesleyan University.
Okay, if you, I started this project with 2 questions in mind. The first question for me is looking in terms of time in the future, what will be difficult to recapture when looking back at the events of the past 18 months? What is it that will not be remembered or will not be appreciated? And the second question that I had is, how can we best or better connect educational experience with the broader social experiences that we've all witnessed during the pandemic? And my solution to those questions was to take a look at affect theory or theories of affect. And in doing so, I rely upon 4 aspects of theories of affect that are closely related to one another, but are not always clearly distinguishable, but I believe them worth considering in some detail. And they include intensities of encounter, meaning making, assemblage, and contingency. Intensities of encounter is a concept that was perpetuated by Deleuze and Guattari, and the emphasis is on encounters of varying intensities that are rhizomatic and horizontal in terms of their linkages. And what I've argued in this piece is that we see different intensities of encounter due to these different factors, including the shrinkage of public space due to school closure, the mixed social roles of teacher, student, parent, where one is required at some point to portray complementary and differing social roles. And as a result of that, that has an effect upon the kinds of encounters we experience and their intensities. So what happens when the parent is forced to play the role of teacher, or when the student becomes caregiver as well as to one's siblings as well as student, or when the teacher becomes primary caregiver. And then another way of looking at intensities of encounter include the challenges of remote learning. And I mentioned, what we're experiencing today, the fact that we agree in our Zoom sessions that as a normal protocol, we allow for the mute button to be operationalized. or we allow the disembodied voice to become acceptable as a part of classroom interaction. And what happens then when classroom interaction is mediated through the computer screen or in the classroom, the mask? These are questions not simply of the comparative value of an instructional technique or of what in fact happens with the advantages or disadvantages of remote learning, but at what point do we substitute the simulation of an educational encounter for the real thing? And I think that affect theory asks us to engage in those questions. A second aspect of affect theory involves meaning making. And meaning making, as articulated by Margaret Weatherall, argues that affect is not simply a case of reacting subconsciously to experiential encounters. It involves making sense of those interactions. And that happens all the time. And it certainly happened during the pandemic. We see it continuing with the questioning of scientific and institutional authority that's been pervasive. We also see it in terms of how we identify or think of the school. At least in the initial stages, the school became a spreader of the virus, a space of contamination, as opposed to a safe space for children. So meaning is always being challenged and new meanings are always occurring. We can't think of the pandemic without thinking of meaning making occurring through assemblage, though. And assemblage, the virtue of the concept is its flexibility and its embrace of contingency. So the notion of assemblage, of coming together in temporary terms, avoids rigid dichotomies of individualism or communitarianism and oversimplistic categorizations. But we see in attempts to create meaning through assemblage globally, the remarkable protests for Black Lives Matter in the wake of the George Floyd murder, the protests in Hong Kong, Belarus, Myanmar, teacher strikes for better working conditions and assistance to children in the wake of the pandemic, and active public protest under dangerous and threatening conditions, which certainly is remarkable. But there's also been the other side of assemblage, assemblage on the part of the right, for the right to disassemble, which becomes the mantra of the right wing. And of course, as has been noted, the lack of opportunity to assemble has disproportionately harmed the urban poor and who are so reliant upon informal networks for help. And then finally, we want to talk about contingency. And contingency refers to all of these different categorizations. In the piece, I note that a number of commentators have referred back to Camus' The Plague and trying to get some sense of understanding of the situation. And in so doing, the arguments that we can't ignore contingency, that any solutions that we seek must be done with a degree of humility commensurate with the contingent circumstances that surround us, recognizing the importance of affect in reacting to contingency and to try to make sense of circumstances that are not always in our control. So although Camus' existentialism is quite passé, his recognition of the permanence of contingency and his realization of the need to work within its constraints holds some contemporary salience. So let me say a couple of words about the responses, some wonderful responses to this piece. Jay Derrick and Tanya Harris really looked in their piece at freelance creative practitioners who've adapted and produced significant informal learning. And they argue that online, particularly online learning, shouldn't be conflated with pejorative notions of the remote. Contingency can be both inhibiting and enabling. And I thought that was very, very useful and very important. Alexander Town did some work looking at Save the Children programs in different mid and lower income countries with regard to efforts to direct and indirectly assist children and their families with learning materials and help. And the response was basically what the project showed is that EdTech solutions were limited in their capacity to provide wider student welfare support. And in fact, that the programs themselves didn't do a very good job of channeling or chronicling what exactly their impact might have been. And then finally, Professors Clark, Ballou, and Andera looked at the Japanese university student experiences. And in Japan, the university is viewed as this space for personal and professional growth. Students negotiate meeting with the 3 dimensions of community, mutual engagement, joint enterprise, and shared repertoire. And their conclusion basically is that the conditions imposed as a result of the pandemic may have altered communities at the university level in Japan in dramatic ways, the consequences of which have yet to be determined. So wrapping up, I think there have been differences of opinion expressed as to what affects actually arise and how they're influencing social behavior. And there are empirical questions as to their power, their influence, their positivity, their negativity, and ensuing discussion is warranted. But the relevance of the components of affect theory that have been discussed, that relevance has not been challenged. And so I continue to look to affect theory as one way, as one lens of trying to make sense of what we have all experienced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irv. Really important lessons to be learned there in terms of we can't get away from the contingent. We will be making meaning, and the best way to do that is together. Thank you very much for that. And next we turn to Professor Iveta Silova, who's at Arizona State University, who was one of the authors on the key piece on nature. Iveta.
Thank you so much, everybody. And I'm very excited to be part of the special issue and would like to thank the editors for pulling it all together and for also really engaging us in a conversation across the different sections and across the different pieces within each section. I thought that that was a really valuable process. So the last section of the special issue brings attention to the parallels and convergences between the coronavirus pandemic and the climate crisis. And I will just start by maybe noting that these parallels are at once really stark and really striking. Both crises have been long predicted and well documented, yet they remain largely ignored. Both are global in nature, unfolding irrespective of the national borders and hitting the most vulnerable populations the hardest, as we have just heard before. Both require intensive international cooperation in implementing mitigation policies in the context of highly competitive global economies. Both call for immediate action and warn that the impact of inaction would be catastrophic. Both trigger also very similar responses. They primarily rely on the techno-scientific solutions to avoid the catastrophe. In the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's the major pharmaceutical multinationals who coordinate leading research scientists, medical professionals, academic institutions, peer review, and public funding to produce a vaccine that some thought was impossible in such a short time. The Pfizer advertising campaign focused on emphasizing the power of science. They wrote on so many billboards, science can overcome diseases, it can create cures, and yet it can beat pandemics. It has before and it will do it again. You have all seen billboards demonstrating the ingenuity of White Lab code scientists and up-close pictures of the colorful DNA helix, the source of nature's pathological secrets. Science will win, they say, as is in the poster behind me. So long before the pandemic, the science was being looked at as a cure for climate crisis too. Its list of salvation promises includes the carbon capture, the bioengineering, the CO2 fighting crops, small cities, refreezing the Arctic, ocean greening, thermoelectrochemical cooling, and so many more techno-scientific solutions. It is as if all we have to do is simply wait patiently for the scientific solutions to miraculously save the world from the climate catastrophe. All we have to do is be patient and wait, it seems. So in our contribution, we invite the readers to pause before getting back to the optimistic normality that everything will be solved by science. And in fact, we ask readers to ponder the question, was the COVID-19 measures really a victory for science? More than, as of today, more than 700,000 Americans are dead, together with another 1 million Europeans. Most live in OECD high-income countries, which are wealthy enough, again, notwithstanding major inequalities, to afford quality medical infrastructures, intensive medical treatments, the therapeutic drugs, massive public health campaigns, online living and work arrangements, and enforcement of lockdown. And this stands in really stark contrast to East Asia, where death rates have been markedly lower. So for example, for every 1,000 American deaths at the end of 2020, there had been between 0.3 deaths in Taiwan or 27 deaths in Japan. So just some examples. So what has produced such drastically different outcomes, and what can we learn from the current health pandemic experience as we prepare to face the climate crisis that is unfolding alongside? So fully recognizing the complex and multidimensional nature of the problem, we propose that it's not only science, but it's also culture that we must consider as an integral part of the equation. We suggest and empirically illustrate the possibilities that societies operating within a generally interdependent cultural framework are much better prepared to respond effectively, not only to the current coronavirus pandemic, but also to the looming climate crisis. Ultimately, these interdependent relationships extend beyond humans and include the Earth's broad ecological community. So it's not only human-to-human interdependence, but also the interdependence with a more than human community. This perspective allows us to see that our survival, both in the short and the long term, depends not only on life-saving technoscience solutions, but also on our capacity to make this cultural shift. And here, education is central to helping us make the cultural shift by re-articulating both culture and self. However, to do so, education itself, we argue, has to radically change, especially education as it is currently understood in Western modernist schooling. So it must itself undergo cultural shift and open itself to the alternatives beyond the Western horizon, where science no longer rules nature or views it as an opponent to be controlled, tamed, or exploited. So in short, we argue that the best vaccine for the COVID-19 and the climate crisis is not a scientific vaccine at all, but a culture of collective responsibility and embedded interdependence of humans and non-humans and more than humans. So this special issue includes 4 excellent pieces that build off and critique this argument from various perspectives. And will briefly mention it to point you to those readings and also urge you to engage with the authors, many of whom are on this Zoom call as well. So Angela Malloy Murphy calls for education, including education for sustainable development, to shift from the relations of mastery and management to reciprocal relations of care. We also have Tom Pegram and Julia Kreinkamp who propose using complexity theory to achieve greater levels of collective and personal resilience in the face of rapid nonlinear change and potential catastrophic risks. Then another contribution is by Georgina Kate Adams, who considers the potential of the permaculture for redesigning education as a tool set for designing sustainable ways of living that emphasize interconnectedness of all life and balances the needs of humans with those of the rest of the world. And finally, the last contribution is by Marcia McKenzie and Christina Kwok, who place the discussion within the broader context of the current political polarization, the anti-science and post-truth orientations, attributable in part to social media algorithms that foster ideological echo chambers. So while acknowledging that science does have important answers, they argue that it should not be approached as the only remedy to the underlying unsustainable worldviews that put profit before people and the planet. So their article shares pedagogical and policy approaches and implications that can help us shift cultural orientations to redress these intertwined emergencies. But finally, just before I end, I also wanted to note that this section of the special issue, the one that explores the connections between COVID and nature, has received the least contributions compared to other sections in the special issue. In fact, it barely had any contributions at all before the first deadline was extended by the special issue editors. This in itself, I would think, suggests the lack of priority we as educators, education policymakers, academics give to the issues of culture and nature in considering our responses to the COVID or climate crisis. Perhaps this is something we could discuss later. And I would be especially curious to hear the perspectives of Will, Elaine, and Moses on this question as special issue editors. But for now, I will end here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Yvette. And your final comment reminded me of the very first education conference I ever went to in 2009. And there was a series of panels on education and sustainable development. And we were given the smallest room of all of the potential rooms in the conference. Very much we overfilled that room, so that was good. And the following year, they gave us larger space. But it was definitely not at the level of priority then that I think we would hope it is now. So thank you very much for that. Before we move on to the Q&A, just to remind you of those 6 parts that we've heard, those interventions from our key authors. And as they said, many of the authors of the parts within are also here today. And my mouse is doing something I don't understand. No. Okay, so we have had some questions into the chat. Thank you very much for that. So I'm just going to ask the questions in the order they came in. The first one is about Indigenous students and Indigenous knowledge. And in Peru, they were spending more time in community and farming, where they were collecting and sustaining important community knowledge. So the question there is, how is it that this in-community or at-home learning can be recognized and honored in formal education? Is that possible? And if so, how? Would anybody like to take on that question? No takers?
I would just say that that is what is called for in lifelong learning. And I mean, part of sustainable development framework, actually, if you ignore the other challenging bits of it, that the idea of lifelong learning should actually incorporate all forms of learning. But it's a good question. That's just a brief comment from myself.
Thank you. And we have somebody else who volunteered. Please go ahead.
Moira Hamida has a hand up.
Hamida, please. And then we have one more person.
I think the moderator has to unmute
the
different participants in the call.
I'm trying to
1 minute.
There we are. Please, Hamida. Can you unmute yourself? And
Yes, yes. And
Please.
now,
yes,
you hear?
perfect.
Yes, I am from Algerian country, and I want to participate with you. Moi, je parle français un peu mieux, mais I try to speak English. So it's very most interesting to participate with you for this reunion, and I want to have a question. How comment le COVID-19 a comment il a influencé sur l'éducation des adultes, ou bien sur l'éducation of general, education en général. Voilà, madame, ma question.
Merci beaucoup, Hamida.
Voilà. Comment le COVID-19 a influencé sur l'éducation, et quels sont les dispositifs qu'on peut prendre pour ce grand problème qui a envahi le monde? Thank you, Miss.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Et j'espère bien que vous allez lire ce special issue dans sa totalité. The question there was, how has COVID education affected adult education particularly? Okay, so we now have Jay, and then Georgina Kate, and then Catherine. Jay.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Moira. I think this is a really good question, the question of informal learning in a world where education is generally thought of as formal, certainly by governments and agencies. And it's to do, I think, a lot with measurement. I'm an adult educator, have been all my career, and I would say the single most important thing we should argue for is measurement of participation rather than outcomes. It seems to me we try to be too precise about what education does, and actually it does all sorts of things, most of which we don't even know about for years. So I just think the idea of measuring needs to be looked at very carefully and in a critical way. I'm not saying we shouldn't take measurements of a quantitative nature, but we should not take them as the only way to measure an activity as profound as education. And participation seems to be more productive and more equitable. The classic adult learner is a part-timer, and most education researchers and most educators and policymakers tend to forget that.
Thank you, Jay, for that very important reminder. Georgina Kate.
Hi there. Yes, I think it's a really interesting point that's raised about Indigenous education. And in my piece in the nature section, I explore the application of permaculture as a design tool set for rethinking education, and what would an education system look like designed using permaculture. So the permaculture design toolset is best known for its applications to land-based settings. So it already kind of comes with that history when we're thinking about maybe Indigenous learning that might be quite closely tied to the land. But as a design toolset, what kind of came out was that by designing education through that lens, you naturally end up with an education system that was much more closely tied to the kind of home realities of the children and what's actually going on. What's not what's the government saying education should look like, but actually what does the local environment need? What does that look like? And where are the local resources? And that includes, who are the Indigenous knowledge holders, and how can they be incorporated into the learning space, and how can their knowledge be shared within the learning environment? So I think permaculture is a really interesting tool set for as we move forwards and think about how can we have Indigenous knowledge much more embedded in our approach to education.
Fantastic. And continuing that theme, I'm sure Catherine Adora Hopkins, one of the leading experts on Indigenous knowledge, please go ahead.
Hello, I'm so glad I'm here, and thank you very much, Iveta, for raising this issue. For me, the question about rethinking education. Really, it is a life and death question, because I said it before in this forum, I think several months ago, that it is the 21st century. And yet we are continuing with the same questions over and over and over. Really, it is so boring, so boring, because if we continue asking the same questions, we produce papers like Professor Emeritus of Oxford produced. It will be the same thing over and over and over. Please, let us take indigenous knowledge as a life force, because in Africa, we have suffered with these same questions for so long. Please let us incorporate other knowledges, because other knowledges can make us live, make us alive, just alive. You get me? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, and Kayla, that was the chain that was inspired by your question about rural indigenous students in Peru, and that disconnect between what's taught outside the classroom, inside the classroom, and what it is that children face in the realities outside that. And so the next question is addressing the historical inequalities. And I think there's a follow-up here, which is about saying, if we try and conceptualize COVID as a one-off event and an event that is conveniently in the past, then that's an attempt to control or manage it rather than actually addressing the trouble of a world riddled with COVID and the responsibilities that come with that. So do we have responses to that question of COVID as a moment in time, COVID as an ongoing situation, and how we actually address the ongoing issues that are not new or fresh, but are being framed that way? Not easy questions to answer. No takers for that one. I think one of the key things that I've taken away from the discussion today is the idea between that there are these tensions and also both and thinking. So where Will was saying some Pascalian meditation and reflection is called for and actually desired, Elaine said, actually, I don't want to be quiet and sitting in a room. And both of those things can be true at the same time. And also we've seen some of the ideas that that was also reflected in Keita's presentation. And then also this idea that the COVID pandemic is a moment in time. Yes, it is. However, there are also these continuities of inequalities, of techno-optimism, and ideas of progress and linearity, and other things which are also continuing. So there are these tensions and also the need to see these as working together. It's both and not either or. And this was also in the nature, COVID, and also climate change and the climate crisis. And this is something that has been dealt with in this special issue, in the conversations inside the different sections, the conversations between those different sections. And I'm sure that we will be continuing these conversations going forward. And now we will put the, did I share my screen or am I just looking at this on my own? I think I'm just looking at it on my own, aren't I? Okay, so now we will put the link for the NORRAG Special Issue number 6 into the chat. We are extremely proud of this. We are extremely grateful to all of the contributors to each of the 6 parts. It is a very important special issue that is coming together here, and we would very much encourage all of you to make sure that you download that that special issue. Daniela, if you could put the launch link into the chat, please, that would be great. And there it is, the one that starts resources.norrag.org. That is the link where you will find that special issue. It is freely available, it is freely shareable, and we would very much welcome you being able to share that with your networks, and also with your classes, with other professionals in your world. So that was NSI 6, and thanks again to everyone who contributed. NSI 7 is currently under review, and that is on education in times of climate change. And we will be launching next week the call for contributions for NSI 8, which is the role of quality education in building durable, just and sustainable peace. And our guest editors there are Kate Moriarty, Yusuf Syed, and Mario Novelli. And we very much look forward to hearing from many authors who would like to contribute to that special issue. We also have an open access book series. The first 3 have been published. When I say they are open access, again, they are freely available. It's not always easy to find it, so do click on the link that Daniela will put into the chat now. Yes, there it is, it's done. And when you get to the link, click on the cover of the book you would like to download, click on preview, and then you will see this, and you can then download the PDF. It is an open access book series. It's a very important part of our mission that our work is open access. And book 4 will be coming next year on systems approaches in education. There's been a discursive shift from sector to system. What might that mean in terms of research, practice, policy, and planning? We will be sending you a feedback survey, 5 minutes or less for you to reply to us so we can improve the next launch that we have. Thank you very much. And we have 2 upcoming events we would like to mention to you. The KIX Europe Asia Pacific Hub Regional Conference, the Education Policy and Innovation Conference. It's the EPIC conference. The link is in the chat now. It's every Thursday for the next 4 weeks. Open access again. And at the end of the month, on the 30th of November, we have the launch of the inaugural Missing Education Data Summit. And it remains for me just to say thank you once again to Will, Elaine, and Moses, to all of the 6 key piece authors, all of the contributors to this NSI 6 for the continuing success of this series of special issues. And thank you all very much for the 160 plus participants who came today, 400 registrations. So there will be more people who'll be watching this recording online after the event. And thank you all for your time, your attention, and for continuing to make this work such a success.